Thank you very much. Good afternoon. Thank you, Rabbi Fuchs. Thank you for inviting me and reaching out to me. And thank you, Jake Jacobowitz, as well, for making the connection and persisting to ensure that I do have the opportunity and privilege to be here. I want to thank all of you for coming out in the middle of the afternoon and for joining. And also, most importantly, I want to thank our hostess, Mrs. Lori Martin. This is a big basement.
Rabbi Brand also
died. When I was a kid, I used to play hockey. I'm from Detroit. So I used to play hockey in the living room, downstairs. This would be great. I also want to acknowledge Rabbi David Weinberger, local Rav, who I believe is the Rav of this group, of the Old Saramain group, and most importantly to dedicate this year to the memory of Sarit Martin, Sor Yuta Bas Ephraim Menachem Mendel Vedina, about 6.5 years ago. So Neshama should have an Aliyah. On my mother's side, I have Hasidic roots. The Lisker Rebbe was a great-great-grandfather of something of my mother. The Lisker Rebbe had 3 sons-in-law. The famous one is the Friedlander one. But there were 2 others, one of them being a great-great-grandfather to my mother. So I never made it as a Hasidic Rebbe. That's the ultimate in Rabbanus, to be a Hasidic Rebbe. So I did the next best thing. I'm a young Israel rabbi. But they tell a story, though, about 2 Hasidim who were having a friendly debate as to whose Rebbe was the greatest. So one Hasid says to the other, my Rebbe is the greatest, because my Rebbe can walk outside, look into the sky, and see from one end of Poland to the other. So his friend says that's quite remarkable, but my Rebbe is even greater. Because my Rebbe can, inside of his house, take a stool, place it by the window, step on the stool, look out the window, and see from one end of Europe to the other end of Europe. To which the first one says, I have to admit, that is much more remarkable than my Rebbe. But I have one question. If your Rebbe is so great and he can see from inside a house across all of Europe, why does he need a stool to step on to see outside the window? To which the second one said, he doesn't really, but he wants to make it look more realistic. So I'd like to talk about why perhaps the second Rebbe is truly greater than the first. Why being able to span the entirety of Europe and be more inclusive is actually greater than a somewhat more narrow vision of just Poland, as a metaphoric example. There is a Hasidic Shavort that they quote in the name of the Sanzer Rebbe, the Divrei Chaim. The Sanzer Rebbe was one of the greatest scholarly and pious Hasidic Rebbes of Poland, father-in-law of the Yavnei Nezer, the Sochachover Rebbe. So they quote in the name of the Sanzer Rebbe, thank you, Al Derech HaChasidus, that the Mishnah says in Maseches Tanis, Mishenichnas Av Mima'atin B'Simcha. From the time that this month began 3 days ago, its inception, so we diminish, we basically eradicate and eliminate joyous festivities. Mishenichnas Av Mima'atin B'Simcha. So the truth is, says the Sanzer Rebbe, that there is a way to read that Mishnah. Says he that Kishmagia HaChodesh Av, the Turei Torah quotes this from the Sanzer, Kishmagia HaChodesh Avim Ha'avelus Shelo, when this month that's replete and saturated with mourning and tragedy and decimation historically and personally, Mimatin B'Simcha, Efsher Lema'et Es Ha'avelus B'Simcha, one can diminish, one can dilute, one can mitigate the Avelus by injecting more Simcha, by injecting more celebration, more festivity. Through Simcha, one can cast away the Avelus and arrive at Geula, at ultimate redemption. So what he means is, Shlomo Zalman Auerbach in Halicha Shlomo, they quote from Shlomo Zalman Auerbach that he was not a big fan of this idea. That the Mishnah means that you don't engage in simcha. But what he said it means, according to the Sanzer, is that simcha shel mitzvah, that if we engage in appropriate, focused, oriented simcha shel mitzvah, simcha of chesed, simcha of avodas Hashem, simcha of bein adam lamakom, bein adam lachavero, between man and God, that kind of simcha will be able to eradicate the avelus and arrive at gula. It's interesting that we all know that the minhag is not to get married during the 3 weeks. The Ashkenazic minhag is not to get married during the 3 weeks. The Sfarad practice is not during the 9 days. I think they quote that when Rabbi Yosef became the Sephardic rabbi in Tel Aviv, that he made sure to ensure that all the Rabbanim would agree that Sephardic families and couples can get married during the 3 weeks until Rosh Chodesh. Because there is no din in the Gemara that you can't get married during the 3 weeks. That's the Ramah quotes that as a minhag Ashkenaz. It's during the 9 days. And the truth of the matter is, the Mishnah Berurah says, that there is no halachic isser. There is no halachic restriction against marriage during the 9 days. In fact, the Gemara says you can have even ma'aris and isha on Tisha B'Av. You can even get erison. Erison is more than engagement. Erison means that I give the girl a ring. I can give her a ring on Tisha B'Av, Shemi Kad Menu Acher. Somebody may usurp my opportunity and jump in and effect the marriage before I do. So you can even get married even on Tisha B'Av. You can't have the party, you can't have the chuppah, that you can't have. Photography and flowers aside, one can certainly do. So even having shidduchim, they quote from Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. Shlomo Zalman Auerbach said that if a couple goes out on dates during the 9 days, so if one of them feels they don't have the proper attire and that they have to wear something clean, freshly laundered, so then they should wear something clean and freshly laundered to go out on the date. So the truth of the matter is, the Mishnah Berurah says to have a full wedding is not us. To get fully married during the 9 days, there is no isser. It just says, the Mishnah Berurah, that it's not simana milsa, that it's not a good omen, it's not auspicious. Getting married during the 9 days is not a way to start a marriage. You want to start a marriage with a good simon, with a good omen, auspiciously, so you start, like there's a minhag. It's also, I think, mentioned Shulchan Aruch and Poskim say, to get married during the first half of the month, rather than the second half. That's not always feasible, but there is such an idea because that's when the moon is increasing in size, as opposed to when it's waning, when it's waxing. So there's such an idea of simana milsa, that omens and how we kind of create the environment or the milieu is something that has importance to an extent. So Mishnah Berurah says there is no halachic isser to get married during the 9 days. How could there be a halachic isser against the mitzvah of getting married? Simcha shel mitzvah. That's why Rav Shechter always told us in Shir that l'kavod Shabbos, of course you shave l'kavod Shabbos. I don't shave during the 9 days. I don't shave the first few days of Shivas B'Tammuz. Then I shave because of a din in Hilchas Aveil that he talked about. That's not important for now. But then I don't shave from Rosh Chodesh on except l'kavod Shabbos. This Friday I shave l'kavod Shabbos. Rav Shechter said, how can there be a minhag against a mitzvah of kibbutz Shabbos? So he says you should not only permitted, one should shave. Mishnah Berurah talks about this a little bit as well. I think Mishnah Berurah quotes from Akiva Eger such an idea as well. That l'kavod Shabbos. When it comes to mitzvah, something like mitzvah l'kavod Shabbos, mitzvah of getting married, mitzvah of simcha, those kinds of things, that's what the Sanzer Rebbe says. That if you want to disperse all the avelus, so you focus on the right types of simcha. The simcha of relationships, the simcha of kavod Shabbos, all of those are what mitigate and diminish and dilute all of the avelus. That's why Rabbi Yosef says there's no reason for Sephardic couples not to get married during the 3 weeks, only during the 9 days. And even that's not based on a halachic restriction, it's based on the fact that we don't do so. We don't engage in that kind of activity. It's not simana milsa, it's not a good omen. But that's the concept that Sanzer Rebbe says, Mishenichnas av mimatin. If you want to diminish the intense pain of this month, so do it with simcha. So the truth of the matter is there's a parallel. The Gemara says in Maseches Tanis, in that Gemara says, Amar Rav Yehuda Breder Rav Shmuel Bar Shilas Mishmei Derav, Kishem Mishenichnas Av Mimatin B'Simcha, Kach Mishenichnas Adar Marbin B'Simcha. The Mishnah talks about Mishenichnas Av, and the Gemara quotes that there is a parallelism between the month of Av and the month of Adar. The month of Av, just as when we begin this month, we diminish our celebration and our joy and our festivities. Similarly, when the month of Adar begins, its inception, we intensify Simcha. So there's a parallel between the two. So that's what I want to focus on, the two sides of the same coin. I think that the holiday of Purim and the commemoration and partial holiday of Tisha B'Av are really bookends of one concept, and that the month of Adar and the month of Av are really designed to be linked and united in a way that I'd like to suggest over the next little while that I have the opportunity to do so. Rav Schachter, in one of his works based on Rav Soloveitchik in Mipnei Harav, quotes the following. When I was in Reitz at Yeshiva University in Smicha, so I had the privilege of learning Nefesh HaChaim, Reb Chaim Volozhin, from Rabbi Walter Wurzberger, Alav Shalom. Rabbi Weinberger is the Rav there now. So Nefesh HaChaim, and I think I wrote a paper on the Tanya. So I don't remember what I wrote exactly, but Rav Soloveitchik, when he was a child, Rav Yosef Dov Soloveitchik, when he was a child, so his father, Rav Moshe Soloveitchik, hired a Melamed, hired a tutor for him. So the Melamed happened to be a Chabad, Chassid. So instead of teaching him Gemara, he used to teach him Tanya. He used to teach him Tanya. That's how Rav Soloveitchik became very enamored with Tanya. Rav Soloveitchik developed a whole thesis about what the Tanya begins with in terms of the fact that when we are in utero, the angel teaches us Kol HaTorah Kula, teaches us the Torah. So Rav Soloveitchik developed a whole thesis about what that means and what the significance of that is. So when Rav Moshe Soloveitchik became aware that he was learning more Tanya than Talmud, he fired the Melamed. But Rav Soloveitchik kept a very close connection to Chabad, Lubavitch, and to Tanya. And Soloveitchik developed an idea, quoted here by Rav Schachter, Mipnei Harav, which has a Kabbalistic basis to it. In Kabbalah, there is an idea, and I'm anything but a Kabbalist, but in Kabbalah there is an idea of mashpia and mushpa, that there are individuals who are designed to influence and impact others, and there are those who are designed to be the recipients, to be influenced by. And that the truth is that no one is supposed to really be exclusively one or the other. It's in Kabbalistic terms, there's the concept of zuchra and nukva, of masculinity and femininity. And that there's a certain aspect of masculinity that's supposed to be giving. It's supposed to be giving. You can go home and say that. It's supposed to be giving. It's supposed to be a mashpia. It's supposed to be an influencer. And nukva, the femininity, is supposed to be a recipient. But it's not as an absolute. In a healthy marriage, both spouses influence and are influenced by each other in a kind of rotating fashion. So in Kabbalistic terms, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, God is also described as having behavioral aspects of Zuchra v'Nukva. That God conducts himself, whatever that means, in sometimes masculine form and sometimes in feminine form. What does that mean? So Rav Soloveitchik explained, based on the Kabbalah, that God is the ultimate mashpia. God is the ultimate influencer. He's the one who is the greatest giver. He's the giver in chief. He's what grants us our life and breath every single moment. But he also has an aspect of him that has a craving, in Kabbalistic terms, to be a mushpa, to be affected by human beings. Almost as if there's a certain vacuum, a certain void that Hashem somehow has that can only be filled, in Kabbalistic terms, by what we do to fill that void in his being. And that's what the Kabbalah refers to as God being a mashpia and a mushpa. Pasuk says, "V'yira Elokim es Adam b'tselem Elokim bara osam zachor nekeva bara osam." So if God created both masculinity and femininity, that means that he endowed human beings with certain abilities. Men have certain abilities and certain limitations. Women have certain abilities and certain limitations. And together, men and women are designed to create shleimus, completeness, wholeness. But clearly then, God has both aspects and is complete in the sense that he has both aspects. But if that he has both aspects, that means that he not only is the ultimate and the infinite mashpia, influencer, and one who has a positive influence and impact on the world and on individuals, but there's an aspect of him that has this quote-unquote vacuum, this need to be mushpa, this need to be influenced. So Rav Soloveitchik said the following. There's a medrash that says, Keshecharav Beis HaMikdash, when the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed, doesn't say whether it was the first or second of the Batei Mikdash. Both were destroyed on Tisha B'Av, both in Yerushalayim. So Bacha v'yolal Hashem ba'atzmo al ha'churban hagadol. So the Medrash depicts that God, the night that the temples, both first, second, whatever, Beis HaMikdash was destroyed, that God cried and wallowed and was just unconsolable and just uncontrollably was crying over the destruction. So when Rav Soloveitchik was a child, he asked his Rebbe, I assume it was that Chabad Rebbe, he asked his Rebbe, Loma tzarech HaKadosh Baruch Hu livkos, hala churban Beis HaMikdash, hala hu hakol yachol. Why does God have to cry? If I was a child and I was building a sandcastle and my brother, I have one older brother, I don't think he ever did this, but it wasn't something beyond his ability to do. If he came over and smashed my sandcastle, so I'd be upset and whatever, and I'd go on a little tantrum, and then I would rebuild it. Because I built it the first time, I can rebuild it the second time. So Rav Soloveitchik asked, so why is God so unconsolable? He's crying uncontrollably over the Churban Beis HaMikdash. So build it again. Just rebuild it. So what's the problem? That was his question as a child. So his Rebbe gave him an answer based on Kabbalah, which Rav Soloveitchik at the time did not understand. But over time, Rav Soloveitchik became aware of what the Kabbalah idea is, and that is that, again, whatever this means in Kabbalistic terms, that Keshahashchina Asura Ba'azikim, when God's presence, when His essence, when His Shechina is locked up, it's chained, then, says Rav Soloveitchik according to Kabbalah, He, the Shechina, Eina Yechol, it's interesting, Shechina is in feminine form, Shechina. Shechina, He Eina Yechol Hishtachrer Levad. The Shechina, God can't liberate Himself. He tzricha lahagia liYehudim sheyatiru lo es hashar shoros. He has to approach, he has to rely on Jews to free him from those chains. B'lashon haKabbalah hayinu omrim she'i efshar at arusa dila'ela b'li at arusa dilatata. At arusa is from the word lehit orer, to be inspired, to be activated, to be catalyzed. So the idea in Kabbalah is that for there to be an inspiration, some activation in Le'ela, up in heaven, there has to first emanate and develop an at arusa, an inspiration, an activation, a movement, latata, down here on earth. That until we do something, God remains chained. So that's the idea that his Rebbe tried to tell him when he was a child, and Rav Soloveitchik understood later, that God destroyed the Beis HaMikdash, but He can't just rebuild it. In order to rebuild it, He needs us to do something, because He's like imprisoned, He's in chains. And until we can somehow sever or cut through His chains by whatever it is that we're supposed to do, He can't do it on His own. Whatever that means in Kabbalah, but the idea, I think, is a very profound idea, that there is such a importance to what we do, that so much so that Hashem depends on us to be able to fill a void that somehow, quote unquote, He can't or won't fill on His own. It's at arusa dile'ela b'li at arusa dilatata. Without our earthly inspiration, instigation, incitement, nothing will shake, nothing will vibrate up in heaven. That's why it was said that the relationship that Hashem created with Jews is designed to be a shutfis. It's designed to be a partnership. Just like in a marriage relationship. The Midrashim describe that clearly. As that when God gave us the Torah at Har Sinai, we were betrothed to Him. He was the chassan, we were the kala. It doesn't say who paid for the wedding. That's a different story. But nonetheless, in that He gave us, and we have this marriage relationship. So that's a shutfis, that's a partnership. Like it says in the Ksuvah, it says, Yishlatu b'nichseihon, shava b'shava. That the couple is supposed to operate and conduct their assets shava b'shava, equally, like equal partners. So that we are, in a sense, not equal partners, but we are partners. We are minority partners, perhaps, but we are partners with Hashem. So what is it exactly that we're supposed to do? And what is it that's preventing Hashem, without us and without our input, to be able to rebuild the Beis HaMikdash? To be able to rebuild the Beis HaMikdash. So two of the Rosh Yeshiva in Torah Vidas years ago were Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky and Rav Gedalia Shor. So Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky and Rav Gedalia Shor both wrote Pirushim on Chumash. Very different Pirushim. You wouldn't know that they were Rosh Yeshiva of the same yeshiva. Two totally different approaches. Rav Emes Yaakov, Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky, has some very, very brilliant ideas. He's very methodical in terms of dicta, in terms of grammar. He develops very, very, very interesting ideas and pshatim based on words and dictic and other things. Rav Gedalia Shor, much more Kabbalistic, much more Hasidic. I'm sure some of you even know his son in Brooklyn is very well, very, very well renowned as well. So in Or Gedaliahu, by Rav Gedalia Shor, he quotes from the Maralmi Prague, and he develops the idea a little bit more, but the Maralmi Prague explains the following. We know that the Gemara tells us that the first Beis HaMikdash was destroyed, the Gemara says in Maseches Yoma, because there were Gimel Devarim. There were three cardinal sins that were violated during the course of the 410 years of the standing of the first Beis HaMikdash. Avodah Zarah, Gilu Arayos, Mishvichas Damim. Idolatry, immorality, incest, adultery, immorality we'll refer to, because that's what it represents. And Shvichas Damim, and murder. So these three, and the Gemara quotes Psukim to talk about it. It's this week's Haftarah in Yeshayahu. Spells it out as well. Yidechem Damim Meleu. Your hands are soaked with blood. So in this week's Haftarah in Chazon Yeshayahu. So those were the three cardinal sins. Because of those three cardinal sins, the first Beis HaMikdash was destroyed. So the Gemara says, though, but why was the second Beis HaMikdash destroyed? The Gemara seems to find it a little bit of a challenge to justify the destruction of the second Beis HaMikdash. Because after all, the Gemara says, Al Mikdash Sheni, Shahayu Oskim Batorah Uvemitzvos, Ugmilas Chasadim. Apparently the Gemara has described that Torah scholarship and knowledge was vast, was basically spread out. It basically permeated the entirety of Eretz Yisrael. So Torah knowledge and study was rampant. Mitzvos, observance of mitzvos, certainly inspired by Ezra when he built the second Beis HaMikdash. And Gemilas Chasadim, apparently there was tremendous kindness and benevolence between people. But there was something missing. So Mipnei Macharev, why was it destroyed? So the Gemara says Mipnei Shehoisa Bo Sinas Chinam. Because there was this, what's referred to as Sinas Chinam. For perhaps lack of a better translation, wanton or needless or baseless or purposeless hatred. Sinas Chinam. It's one thing to have hatred for a purpose. The Torah talks about sometimes hating Amalek, hating the Nazis. That has a purpose. It's important to hate the Nazis to this very day. God forbid anyone should forget what happened and what they did and how unfathomable that was. To not still carry with us hatred for that would be a problem for us. So that's not sinas chinam. Sinas chinam means that I hate someone and I don't have a purpose to it. I don't have a basis. Maybe I have some justification, but what's the purpose? And as a result of it, it only degenerates into actually hurting the other person unnecessarily, unfairly, and needlessly. So sinas chinam. That's why this hatred caused the destruction of the second Beis HaMikdash. So the Maralmi Prague, as Rav Gedalia Shor quotes, says that these are not just incidental historic facts. That the first Beis HaMikdash was destroyed because of the violation of three cardinal sins, and the second one because of this wanton hatred. That's not what it means. What it means is that the first Beis HaMikdash was in existence because the Jewish people were adherent to these three principles. And when they compromised and degenerated and neglected those, then it automatically created a vacuum in which it destabilized the Beis HaMikdash and it could no longer exist. Just as if it was destroyed because of immorality, idolatry, and murder, that means that the first Beis HaMikdash was mekuyam. It was established. It was stabilized through the focus of this. If you imagine that the first Beis HaMikdash represented really the very beginning of the Jewish people's history in Eretz Yisrael. By the time that Shlomo HaMelech built the first Beis HaMikdash, so the Jewish people were still a young nation, still a relatively young nation. So this was their first Beis HaMikdash. So if you're building a first Beis HaMikdash is supposed to embody the fundamental principles of establishing a new nation. When establishing a new nation, these are the three principles of a new nation. There should be no idolatry, meaning that there should be an absolute acceptance of God as the one and only one God. If that somehow doesn't exist, then the whole religion falls apart, and there's no Beis HaMikdash, there's no Jewish people. So if we don't accept God as God and as the one God, so that automatically unravels. If there isn't basic morality, Gila Arayas, incest, immorality, adultery, besides what it does in hurting other people, in terms of basic ethic, in terms of basic morality, without that in place, a society cannot exist. And Shvichas Damim, it's interesting. It's sad, I think, but it's interesting. Without in any way commenting pro or con about the NRA, but I find it very, very disturbing that in this country, gun control, gun rights is like the number 2 or number 3 discussion. Let's assume that based on constitutional and Declaration of Independence, people have the right to bear arms. That's fine. But the fact that it is the number 2 or number 3 issue, shouldn't the number 2 or number 3 issue be all of the murders that happen? We talk about murder rate being down. Why should there be a murder rate that it should be down or up? The fact that murder is, unfortunately, somehow philosophically tolerated in this country. Well, there were only 2 murders. Oh, they were down 3. This month they were down. The fact that that isn't the number 1 issue means that, unfortunately, even in this country, American society, one nation under God, somehow the respect for human life is not where it should be. Where the respect for rights, which is very important, to bear arms, which is very important, let us assume, should override in importance and in lobby the significance of human life. That's not a society that can continue and exist indefinitely. That's Shvichas Damim. To have the ability to murder someone else with that kind of callousness, that kind of lack of basic respect for human beings, for Tselem Elokim, the image of God. So those are 3 fundamentals. So the first Beis HaMikdash was premised on basic monotheism, basic morality, and basic respect for human beings. And that's the way the first Beis HaMikdash, during the fledgling era of the Jewish people's development in Eretz Yisrael, that's what was necessary. And when that unraveled, and when those 3 were violated and compromised, then it automatically destabilized the Beis HaMikdash, says the Maharal Prague, and it couldn't exist. It's not that that was the sin that God decided to punish. Without those 3 intact, automatically, it's like the foundation is taken away. It's like you remove these pillars, the roof will come down. It's not because of a punishment. By definition, a Beis HaMikdash, a nation, can't exist without these 3 premises. And those had to be corrected. And the Gemara says they were corrected, because by the time the Bayis Sheni was built, those were corrected. There was no longer Shvichas Damim, there was tremendous Avodas Hashem, Mitzvahs, Gemilas Chasadim, all of those were corrected. That was fine. But what was not fine? So if you're building a second Beis HaMikdash, and the first 3 fundamentals of a nation are already concretized and stabilized, then you want to go to a higher level. You want to go to a higher tier. So what was it that was that which prompted the second Beis HaMikdash's development, and what destabilized it? So they quote here, we know that the Chag of Purim was that which propelled the building of the second Beis HaMikdash. But not only historically, because of Esther and having Daryavish and Koresh and the accessibility to building the second Beis HaMikdash, was more than that. Gemara uses a term in Maseches Megillah that Purim was an Aschalta de Geula, that it was the beginning of the redemption process, Aschalta de Geula. Remember Rav Shechter mentioning in Shir once that term, Aschalta de Geula, usually we assign to a kind of religious Zionist view of Eretz Yisrael, Medinat Yisrael. It's Aschalta de Geula, the beginning of the redemption. He said that the Gemara has such a concept of Aschalta de Geula. Rabbi Lamb, interestingly, Rabbi Norman Lamb, at least to my knowledge, past, was never very fond of using the term Aschalta de Geula, the beginning of the redemption regarding Hakamat HaMedina, the establishment of the state of Israel. So how does one know that that's the Aschalta de Geula? How do you know? And Rav Shechter was saying, sure, that he feels otherwise, that it is Aschalta de Geula. Whatever it is, but the concept exists in the Gemara, that there is such a notion that historically there is a kind of preamble to Geula, to redemption. And Purim was the Aschalta. And how is it the Aschalta? So historically it was the Aschalta. Esther married Achashverosh. She, and through her children, and Dayavish and Koresh, they rebuilt. But it was more than that. They quote here in Gedal Yeshur in the footnotes here, that what was it that was plaguing the Jewish people at the time of Purim? So Haman tells us, Haman says to Achashverosh, Yeshno ha'mechad mefuzor mefrod bein ha'amim, that there is a nation, that they're spread out, they're dispersed, they're not united. So I want you to know, Achashverosh, you have nothing to worry about from them. Because as long as they are not united, there's no possibility of them ever being liberated and reaching Geula and rebuilding the Beis HaMikdash. So what was the counter force for that? So what does Esther tell? Lech kenos es kol haYehudim. Go and gather all the Jewish people together. Ritsumu alai, val tochlu val tishu yom v'layla, ani b'na rosai otzum kain. The counterforce is to unite. The counterforce is to unite. That's why all of the mitzvahs of Purim are designed to unite people. It's interesting. It's the one day of the year, it says in Shulchan Aruch, where you don't have to kind of be a little bit conscientious about to whom one gives tzedakah. There's a din in Shulchan Aruch that one's not supposed to just kind of wantonly give away money to someone who comes if there's a question whether or not the person's valid. It's a din in Shulchan Aruch that one's supposed to investigate and determine the appropriateness or not. But on Purim, that's suspended. The idea being that we kind of bring in everybody. Even if the person is a little suspicious, we unite everybody. Everybody's included. Everybody's included. So all of the mitzvahs, we try to include everybody. So that the purpose of the Chag of Purim, as explains here, that was the purpose, that was the Hakdama. The miracle of Purim created that which was necessary. Because during Bayis Rishon, the most important things that were missing were the fundamental principles of morality, of monotheism, of human dignity and respect for human life. And those were corrected by Bayis Sheni. But there was also something else that was missing in Bayis Rishon, but it wasn't important at that point because the fundamentals had not yet been corrected. And that was the fact there was tremendous pirud. There was tremendous discordance and disunity. When were the kingdoms divided during Bayis Rishon? The southern kingdom, the northern kingdom. Malchus Yisrael, Malchus Yehuda, Shlomo HaMelech, Rechavam. All of that history where the kingdoms were divided. That was during Bayis Rishon. All of that happened. So God says if you want to rebuild the second temple, it's not enough just to establish or reestablish or reaffirm the three fundamental principles. I'm not going to come back just for those. That was enough during Bayis Rishon when you were a fledgling nation. But if you want to reach a higher sphere, a higher tier, you're now a more mature nation. It's not enough just to be committed to Torah, Avodah, Gemilas Chasodim, all of the fundamental principles. You have to also correct that divisiveness, that discordance. And that discordance which developed also during Bayis Rishon of the separation of the kingdoms and all that happened, that has to be corrected. And that was corrected during Purim. That's exactly what Esther did. It's not just the fact that she married Achashverosh and then had offspring that we are able to give access and permission and authorization to rebuild the Beis HaMikdash, and Ezra could do so. It was the fact that she brought the people together and united them. That unification of the Jewish people was the prologue, was the preamble, was the absolute introduction, Hakdama, to the second Beis HaMikdash. And that's why, says the Maharal, when that fell apart, when there developed sinas chinam, when the divisiveness penetrated and permeated again into the Jewish people, when there were the Tzedukim and the Prushim and everything that happened during Bayis Sheni, the Second Temple, over time of the disruption of the unity, then it's not a question of punishment. It's a question of the Beis HaMikdash can't survive. The second Beis HaMikdash was premised not just on Torah, Avodah, Gemilas Chasodim, it was premised on unity and coming together. And when there was sinas chinam, which by definition creates rifts and divisiveness, then it automatically destabilized and fell apart. That's how the Maharal explains. That's that one of the fundamental foci, one of the of the Yamein group is Shmiras HaLashon. So the Chavetz Chaim in his Hakdama, in his introduction, explains why he wrote this, why he thinks this is so important. Why of all the mitzvos did he pick on this? He put together a Mishnah Brura and other Svarim and all. Why did he particularly pick to kind of enhance and elaborate on Shmiras Lashon? So he tells us in the Hakdama, in his introduction to the Sefer Shmiras Lashon, Sefer Chavetz Chaim, he quotes the Gemara that we refer to, Ach lebesof yemei bayisheni, Gavra sinas chinam. There was an intensification. It wasn't just that there was a little bit of hatred, a little bit of disunity. It was gavra. He describes that there was an intense sinas chinam, hatred. V'lashon hara beinenu, b'avonosinu harabim. V'avur zeh, because of this lashon hara, this disparaging, this maligning people, this hatred for people. V'avur zeh nechrav habayis v'golin rasin. We were cast and we were exiled. He says Hagam. He says. But the Gemara doesn't say Lashon Hara. The Gemara says Sinas Chinam. The Gemara doesn't say Lashon Hara. So he says, because he's intellectually honest, he says, Hagam Shah Gemara Nokta Sinas Chinam. I know that the Gemara uses the phrase Sinas Chinam, this hatred, but that's what it means. Hakavani hi al Lashon Hara Gam came. Because she yotzes mitzad sina. Why would I speak so critically about another human being? Why would I try to besmirch another person's reputation? So if I have a purpose, if I'm afraid, if I want to protect another person, I'm afraid, that's one thing. That's not sinas chinam. I'm doing it for a purpose to protect another human being. That's not sinas chinam. It's like reporting those who perhaps commit really, really horrible things of molestation. So there's no halachic issue. It's absolutely not a halachic issue. That of course reporting it to the authorities is halachically sanctioned, because that's not sinas chinam, that's not lashon hara, that's not malshin. We're doing it to protect other human beings that unfortunately are not adequately protected. But that's not sinas chinam. He's saying sinas chinam, when I speak lashon hara, if I'm going to besmirch someone, I want to speak about someone else, and I want to talk about how this person does this or that, or how they're not able to do this, or whatever it is I want to talk about them and their family. It emanates from sinas chinam. If I really like them, if I really care about them, if I'm really concerned about them, I'm not going to speak negatively about them. We all know that. We all know that. Whether you're pro or con, you know that those who support President Obama, they would never say lashon hara about President Obama. Even if he makes a mistake, they won't say lashon hara about him, because they have such ahava. Such ahava. So if I can speak negatively about somebody, that means I must have not ava, I must have sinna. Unless I'm doing it to be helpful and not to criticize, but to critique and help, that's a different story. But that's avas chinam can be so extensive that maybe I overlook a person's shortcomings. Sinas chinam can be so judgmental that I only focus on their shortcomings. I don't look at the whole person. What does the Mishnah say? I'm trying to remember now. The Mishnah talks about in Pirkei Avos, talks about the ha'adam. I forget now the exact, but the portion talk about that you have to sometimes look at the whole person. You can't just look at one aspect of a person. You have to look at the whole person and see the whole person as a whole. So that's what the Chavetz Chaim explains that lashon hara really means. So the essence of lashon hara is predicated on sinas chinam, and that's what the Gemara means. Therefore, that's what he describes, and he writes in very strong language. Our tefillos, our prayers, are not that effectively accepted by God these days. We believe they can be, we believe that they still are, but he writes that they are not as efficaciously accepted by God. Why? He says, Gemara says in Brachos, Miyom shenechrav Beis HaMikdash, from the time that the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed, Choma shel Barzel, sounds like the Berlin Wall. Choma shel Barzel, an iron wall, mafsekes, separates bein Yisrael avim shebashamayim. The reason for that is quite simple. If I do something to create a wall between me and another Jew, then God says, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to copy you. I'm going to create the same wall. If you can't break down your walls, why should I break down mine? It's interesting, Rav Soloveitchik is quoted a few sources. Professor Lustiger quotes in some of his wonderful works in Rav Soloveitchik about the Yom Noraim, the high holidays, the days of awe, I think was one of the names of the book. So he quotes, Rav Soloveitchik has a whole idea. The Mishnah tells us in Maseches Yoma that Ein Yom Kippur mechaper el alvona shebein odom l'makom. that Yom Kippur can only atone for sins that I transgress against God. If I don't eat kosher, I don't keep Shabbos, so I can ask forgiveness, and God can forgive me through the medium of Yom Kippur. But beinotam lachavero, if I hurt another human being, so Mishnah says, Ein Yom Kippur mechaper ad sheyafayis chavera, until I ask mechiva, until I sincerely regret and am remorseful and ask my friend, person, spouse, child, parent, whatever it may be, for forgiveness, I don't receive. So Rav Soloveitchik in the Gemara quotes a pasuk L'fnei Hashem titharu, that you can become purified on Yom Kippur in the presence of God for anything you did against God. But what you did against man, you can't achieve kapara on Yom Kippur alone without appeasing and reconciling with your friends. So Rav Soloveitchik developed an idea, in brief, that the Gemara means more than that. The Mishnah of the Gemara means more than that. The Mishnah of the Gemara means that until we reconcile with our family, with our friends, Ein Yom HaKippur mechaper, Yom Kippur won't even atone for that which I violate against God. God says, don't clap al chet for your eating non-kosher until you reconcile with your friend. That's what the Lifnei Hashem, before you approach God, titharu, you have to purify your own relationships. And until then, there will be no atonement for Yom Kippur. That's because part of the idea of Yom Kippur is the same idea of Purim in the second Beis HaMikdash. The kapar of Yom Kippurim is v'nislach. We begin Yom Kippur that way. V'nislach l'chol adas b'nei Yisrael v'lager ha'gober salcham ki l'chol ha'am b'shgaga. We ask God to allow us to be mifal im ha'arvar yonim. That we want everybody to be united, even those who sin, even those who don't keep Shabbos, even those who don't keep kashrus, even those who don't. We want to be able to facilitate that we're all united. That you should have forgiveness for all the Jewish people, because the atonement of Yom Kippurim is not like the kapara of all year round. All year round I can affect individual personal kapara. I can do tshuva every single day. Gemara encourages that. Gemara, according to one opinion, says we're judged every single day, so we should do tshuva every single day. But the kapara, the atonement process and mechanism of Yom Kippurim, has to do with a unification of the Jewish people and a certain degree of tolerance, of being able to kind of daven, to be with, to accept, not necessarily agree, to accept other Jews as well. And that unification, so the Gemara says, based on the pasuk, says Rav Soloveitchik, that until you can reconcile between friends and family, you can't even affect atonement and forgiveness for beinot lamakom, between man and God. That won't happen. They have to be part of the same process. So that's what the Chavetz Chaim says here, that God's not going to listen to our prayers until we, and it's not as effectively, until we are able to break the barriers. So the Chavetz Chaim quotes a pasuk at the end of Sefer Dvarim. Vayiru Shur Melech b'sasef Rashayom Yachad Shiftei Yisrael. So the pasuk says that when will God be a king? In Yishurin b'sasef Rashayom Yachad Shiftei Yisrael. So he quotes the Chavetz Chaim from Rashi, quotes from the Sifrei. She'em Asayhu Melech b'Yishurun. When will God reign supreme? Dafka kishehem b'Yachad Shiftei Yisrael. Only when all the Jewish people are united. V'lo agudos, and not divided into groups that kind of are conflicting groups, that are adversarial. It's okay to have different subgroups. The United States is one country, but it has states. We are one nation, we have tribes. And we don't have to all be of the same exact mindset, the same exact philosophy. One can have different groups, but not if the agudos are designed to be adversarial with each other and intolerant of each other and claim to have a superiority or a supremacy of knowledge or wisdom or insight into divinity, into hashgacha that others don't have. That's what the Chavetz Chaim says, and we know that how do you create divisiveness? You want to create divisiveness, just speak negatively about people, for sure it will work to create divisiveness. That's what the Chavetz Chaim, that's how he explains. It's based on that sinas chinam, that same idea. Rav Yitzchak Mirsky, in his wonderful Sefer Gyoni Halacha, so he quotes a very interesting medrash from the Mechilta. The Mechilta says, Ashlo nivchara Yerushalayim, hoysa kol Eretz Yisrael ru'uya l'shchina. Mishanivchara Yerushalayim, yatzasa Eretz Yisrael. Until Yerushalayim was chosen as the religious capital of Eretz Yisrael, the entire Eretz Yisrael was equally fitting for God to reside in, for His Shekhinah to permeate and penetrate. Mishanifchar Yerushalayim, but once Yerushalayim was chosen, then Yatzasei Eretz Yisrael. It's as if God kind of concentrated, like a tzimtzum. He concentrated His Shekhinah into Yerushalayim. And what's so important about Yerushalayim? What's so special about Yerushalayim? What's so special about Yerushalayim? Apartments are very expensive. What's so special about Yerushalayim? So why are they so expensive? Why is Yerushalayim so special? So he quotes that Yerushalayim, we know the Pasuk says in Tehillim, one of the Shir Malos, that we use the term Ke'ir shechubra lo yachtov. What that means, he says, is the following. We know the Gemara has a halachic principle. We know that all the territories in Eretz Yisrael were divided amongst the Shvatim. We just discussed in the Parshios last few about Bnei Tzlachad wanted to retain the proprietary rights of the estate of their father. And then when they wanted to get married, people from their tribe said if they're going to marry outside the tribe, we're going to lose it. So the idea being that each tribe had their own territorial claims. That wherever God was, that was their territory. And it's not Asher's. Asher's is a different place. So that's as the Torah describes, the boundaries of each tribe. There was one place, though, in Eretz Yisrael that had no territorial rights to any Shevet, to any tribe. The Gemara says, Yerushalayim Schalka, Yerushalayim Lishvatim. That Yerushalayim was never, in proprietary terms, divided to any tribe. It's considered to be a city that belongs equally to each and every tribe. No one has greater rights. That's because Yerushalayim is designed by housing the Beis HaMikdash and by its very nature to bring Jews together without any greater claims of superiority. Yerushalayim, what is in the Beis HaMikdash? So in the Beis HaMikdash we have one Kohen Gadol, we have a Melech who sits in the Azara. We have place for men and women, Ezras Nashim. Even on Hakel, we bring the children. Why do we bring the children? That's Gemara says. Rashi quotes, why on Hakel, the year after the Shemitah year, why on the second day of Sukkos do we bring the children? That's Gemara says. Rashi quotes, Lama Nut Fitaf. But part of the idea is because if you want to unify a nation, you have to have all members of the nation there. Whether it's men, women, children, everybody has to be there. Otherwise, it's not unified. The whole concept of Aliyah L'Regel, making the pilgrimages, is designed to bring people together. They all come together. All of you have been to Eretz Yisrael, you know you meet everybody in Eretz Yisrael. Whether when I was a kid growing up, it was Malone LaRome. But whatever, at Inbal, wherever it is you go, you meet people from all over the world and from places that, people, and it's a uniting city. So united, the entire world wants to have a chelik in it. But they don't understand that at the end of the term, it doesn't say United Nations, it just says United Nation. So it's just one nation is supposed to be Yerushalayim, not all the nations. They added an S, but okay. So United Nations, it's one nation's capital. And it's a capital because it doesn't belong to any one tribe, any one chelik, any one particular group of the Jewish people, and therefore it is the uniting city. That's when Rashi quotes the famous Rashi in the prologue to the Har Sinai. Rashi quotes on the pasuk Vayichan Sham Yisrael Neged Hahor. Jewish people, kind of in singular terms. Rashi says Ki Yishachad B'Lev Echad. So it's not just like a nice idea. The Jewish people were united before they came and received the Torah at Har Sinai. That was a prerequisite. God says, if I'm going to give you the Torah, I'm not going to give it to you if you're not united. That's fundamental. You first have to be united. I understand that during Bayis Rishon, as you enter Eretz Yisrael and you develop yourselves as a new nation, kind of anew in a new land, so there are certain fundamentals we have to put in place. Torah, Avodah, Milas Chasodim, monotheism, basic principles of human respect for life in terms of morality. And there will be areas of divisiveness and discord, and there will be the break in the Malchus and the monarchy between the north and the south. But that will have to fix again. Just like Gemara says that Purim was another Kabbalas HaTorah. Just like the first Kabbalas HaTorah is based on unity, the second one, the Gemara says, Purim was another receiving of the Torah. The Gemara says based on unity, which Esther accomplished, and that's what she effected, and that's what the second Beis HaMikdash was premised on. And when that fell apart, the second Beis HaMikdash fell apart as well. And that was the reason for that. In this week's Haftarah, the Torah describes, the Haftarah, Yeshayahu, says that in very, very harsh terms, the Yeshayahu talks about the fact that Lamali Rov Zivchechem. I know that you're all pious, and you all are very fervent, and you bring all kinds of sacrifices. God says, Lomali, I'm not interested in your sacrifices. I'm not interested in Chodesh v'Shabbos Karo Mikra. I'm not interested in your Shabbos. I'm not interested in your Rosh Chodesh. I'm not interested in all of that. Sana nafshi. It's a very harsh term. God says, it's repugnant to me. Your observance of Shabbos, of Chachim, of Moadim, I hate it. I detest it. Why? So the Pesukim says, Kisdom hayinu. The Navi Yeshayahu compares us to Sodom. I mean, that's one of the worst things you can compare somebody to Sodom. I come from Detroit. I mean, Detroit is not the greatest. When I grew up in Detroit, so I'll never forget this. So this is a long time ago. I still see the blue swastika that was painted on the stone front of our house in Detroit. It was never able to be erased. A huge swastika. It's in my image. I can see it. It's blue swastika. This is 45 years ago, whatever. I can see the swastika. So to identify, someone as Sodom, that's a very, very harsh condemnation of the Jewish people. We're like Sodom. And the Bible says, what is it that we did wrong? Yedechem damim aleyu. Again, you've resorted to lack of respect for human beings. And what have you not done? Limdu heitev, dear Shumishma, why don't you do things that are ethical? Ashruchama shiftu yasom rivu almana. Why don't you give proper justice on behalf of the orphans, on behalf of the widow? Why don't you advocate for the almana, for the widow, for those who are perhaps less capable for themselves? Many almanas are quite capable, many yasom. But the idea being, conceptually, those not. Describes all the ethical breakdown. Chavrei ganavim, kulo ohev shochad. These are things that unfortunately plague our community. We have wonderful people who are very meticulous in Torah, Avodah, even Gemilas Chasadim and charity. But somehow when it comes to business ethics, somehow, I don't know, somehow they were absent that day in school or yeshiva or whatever it is. Somehow that just ethics, to the extent of hurting other people and taking away other people's. I'm not talking about major things like Madoff. I'm talking about millions and millions. I'm talking about tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, small amounts. But kind of the idea of compromising kashrus because of money by people who are daven 3 times a day, put on tefillin. Maybe they even put on tefillin Shel Rabbeinu Tam. I don't know. Which is a wonderful thing, but not if it's ganovin. The basic concept, that's sinas chinam. If you don't have basic respect for another human being, if you don't care, if you have sinas chinam, if you're so disunified, if you don't care, it's unfortunate that in our communities we have the issue of whether it's abuse of various types, molestation of various types, perpetrated by people who understand the 3 fundamental principles of monotheism, principle of basic human. They'd never kill anybody. They never commit perhaps immoralities on a kind of immoral basis, but somehow to damage another human being's life and then deny it, and then be backed up by presumed leaders of a community. God says, I'm not interested in you. First unite. First accept. First tolerate. Because the Gemara says, the Maseches Sukkah, the Gemara says that unlike the mitzvah of lulav, where each of us has to own our own lulav, the Gemara says, Chachamim Omrim, that Afal pi shomer einod yotze de chavos b'yom tov rishon b'lulav shel chavero yisiyod de chavos b'sukol shel chavero. Diksiv kol ha'ezrach b'Yisrael yeshu b'sukos malamed shkol Yisrael ru'im leisha b'sukkah achas. Kol ha'ezrach b'Yisrael, every citizen of the Jewish people can sit together in one sukkah. Melamed, Shekol Yisrael, the entire Jewish people, Ru'uyim. Ru'uyim not only means that technically they could, means that that's the kind of level of virtue we should have, that we should all be able to sit under the same sukkah. Even if I don't agree with everything that that person believes in, or that person. If they are under the same sukkah, then I can't hate them, I should accept them, not necessarily accept their views. Unfortunately, however, there are people who have removed themselves from the sukkah. Not every Jew deserves to be in the same sukkah. I'm not naive to think that somehow every single Jew deserves to be under the same sukkah, and every Jew deserves to be embraced and to cancel sinas chinim. Unfortunately, there are some Jews who have lost that privilege by whatever they have done, whether they've done that by harming another human being in a way that's simply unacceptable, whether they've compromised other people's parnasa or finances, whether they've done whatever they've done. If a person doesn't even believe in God, it's one thing if a person believes in God and, okay, they're not yet Shomer Shabbos. They still have a right to be in that sukkah. If they don't believe in God, so then they're in the wrong sukkah. You know the story about the shul that was struggling to get a minyan, so they were standing outside trying to find its center, trying to find a tent. So this fellow walks by, and they're asking people, are you Jewish? So one fellow walks by, and they ask, are you Jewish? He says, no, I'm atheist, thank God. So if a person doesn't believe in God, so they can't be in the same tent. But one has to have certain basic principles of Jewish faith to be in the same tent. But if a person perpetrates against another human being, sinas chinam, then that person's not in the same tent. That's what the pasuk says, that I'm not interested in whatever you do. If you can't develop basic sensitivity to other human beings, if you have sinas chinam, you hate somebody who is the victim and you turn the victim into the perpetrator, then you're not in the same tent. And we shouldn't believe that they should. That's the kind of sinas chinam that the Yeshayahu talks about, and that's the idea of the second Beis HaMikdash. It's unfortunate that somehow the second Beis HaMikdash has not yet permeated with resonance enough within the Jewish community. We have developed tremendously, to our credit, the first Beis HaMikdash principles, not with perfection necessarily, but that's not necessarily expected, of Torah, Avoda, Gemilas Chasadim. When else do you have Torah? I mean, not just through media. You have Torah all over the world. Amazing, the Torah that is proliferated throughout the world. Avoda, the amount of people that daven today, Gemilas Chasadim, the kindness. Those principles are intact. First Beis HaMikdash has been restored. It's the second Beis HaMikdash that's still absent. That's the one that hasn't been rebuilt. It didn't take long for the first one to be rebuilt based on unification, but then that fell apart and it still hasn't, because until, that's what the Medrash says, that's what Rav Soloveitchik understood. When the Medrash says that God cried and bemoaned the destruction, so Rav Soloveitchik says, so rebuild it. So the answer is, God says, I can't rebuild it. What am I going to rebuild? I'm going to rebuild the second Beis HaMikdash, and I'm going to bring in all the groups of the Jewish people, and some of them are going to throw stones at girls going to school. That's sinas chinam. I'm not building a second Beis HaMikdash for that. I'm going to build a second Beis HaMikdash, and everybody thinks they deserve to be under the same tent. When you fix the sinas chinam, then I'll build the second Beis HaMikdash. That's why He needs us. Because God wishes, but it's not how He operates the world. He doesn't force us to like people. He can sometimes force us not to do something against, or force us to do, like with Paro. But He can't force us. But He could, but that's not how He operates the world. He's not going to force us to have avas chinam. So He says that I'm stuck, I'm chained. Until you correct the sinas chinam, until you correct that, I'm chained. That's why I can't be a mashpia, I can't influence this. I have to be mushpa. There's a vacuum that exists that only we can fill, that only we can rectify, repair, and correct. And until we do so, Lamali Rav Zivchechem. The first Beis HaMikdash has been taken care of, and it's important and not to be stopped. God doesn't say, don't bring the sacrifices. It doesn't mean that much to me. But Shifti Yasom Rivu Almanat, take care of all of the enmity, all of the hostility, all of the discordance. Don't agree with everybody. Don't accept everybody's opinion. I'm not saying that. This is not a monolithic religion. There's Dan, there's Yehuda, there's Binyamin. There's all kinds of different opinions. All kinds of different opinions. There's Chasidus, there's Yeshivish, there's Modern Orthodox, there's this, there's that, whatever it is, however it is. But sinas chinam, if it's not going to be unity, then there can't be. That's what, just to close, that's what the idea that the Sanzer Rebbe says, that the ultimate simcha, as we know, is to be able to bring people together. That's why we assume, based on Gemaras, that the ultimate simcha can only be experienced in the Beis HaMikdash. Gemara has that concept, in the Beis HaMikdash. Why is that? Because that's where everybody comes together equally. The greatest simcha is when we come together. We know that there are times we like to be on our own, like to be a little bit alone, like to have some space, but ultimately the greatest simcha is when we get together with family or friends. That's simcha. So that's what Chanzer Rebbe says, Mishenichnas Ador, Marbin B'Simcha. We want to intensify simcha, so let's unite. Mishenichnas Av Mematin, if you want to disperse all of the triggers for the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, so use the same simcha that Esther used in Ador, use it in Av, and try to bring people together, and try to unify, and try to be more tolerant, more accepting, not of like mind. Don't compromise your own principles. That doesn't mean that you have to hate someone. Doesn't mean that you have to despise someone. This doesn't have to speak so harshly about another person. You can critique another person. Rishonim do it all the time. They critique. The Ravid was not afraid of critiquing the Rambam. I can tell you for sure he had the most amazing love for the Rambam. He didn't hate the Rambam. He critiqued him academically. That's fine. You don't have to agree with this chief rabbi's view or that chief rabbi's view, but you have to have a certain basic tolerance of another Jew, not only whether he's a Rav or not a Rav, in spite of being a Rav, whatever it may be. So that's basic concept. That's what the Pasuk says here, and that's why the Hasidic Rebbe, the second one, who could see from one end of Europe to the other, and was more inclusive, that's why he's the better Rebbe. The first one saw Poland. Couldn't kind of see beyond Poland. But if you can see beyond Poland and kind of unite all of Europe and then some, that's the greatest Rebbe. That's the one who brings people together. That's the Ahavas Chinam to counteract Sinas Chinam to hopefully rebuild the Beis HaMikdash. Thank you.